You are told that the world is as it must be, that the order governing your lives is natural, eternal, beyond question. You are told that poverty is a failure of character, that wealth is a reward for virtue, that power belongs to those who have earned it. These are not truths. They are lessons carefully drilled into you so that you mistake submission for common sense and exploitation for destiny. From the moment you enter society, you are educated not to understand it, but to obey it. You are taught to see wages as generosity rather than theft, competition as freedom rather than coercion, and inequality as an unfortunate accident rather than a necessary feature of the system that rules you. The greatest lie ever told is not spoken loudly, it is whispered daily until it sounds like reason itself. Look closely at the foundation of this society. A minority owns the land, the factories, the machines, the resources, and therefore the future. The majority owns nothing but its labour power, which it must sell in order to live. This is not a partnership. It is a relation of domination. The worker creates wealth, but does not control it. The worker produces value, but receives only a fraction of it. The surplus is seized, accumulated, and converted into power over those who produced it. You are told that the market is neutral, that it rewards talent and punishes laziness. Yet the child of the capitalist inherits abundance without lifting a finger, while the child of the worker inherits exhaustion before learning to speak. You are told that success is individual, but failure is personal. In truth, both are social. The system requires winners and losers, and it ensures their positions long before effort enters the story. You are told that freedom exists because you may choose your employer, as though choosing which master to serve abolishes servitude. You are free, they say, to starve. Free to accept degrading conditions. Free to compete against your fellow workers for survival, while those above you never compete at all. This is not freedom, it is disciplined necessity disguised as choice. The ruling ideas of every age are the ideas of the ruling class. Those who control material production also control mental production. They shape morality, law, religion, and culture to reflect their interests, then present these interests as universal truths. Property becomes sacred. Obedience becomes virtue. Resistance becomes crime. And the worker is trained to blame himself for conditions he did not create and cannot change alone. Capitalism does not merely exploit labor, it fragments it. It isolates workers, pits them against one another, reduces human relationships to transaction. It transforms time into a commodity, life into a balance sheet, and human creativity into profit for others. Under this system, the worker becomes alienated from the product of labor, from the act of labor, from fellow workers, and ultimately from himself. You are told that this is progress. Yet progress for whom? Machines increase productivity, but leisure disappears. Wealth multiplies, but insecurity spreads. Science advances, but millions lack the means to live with dignity. The contradiction is not accidental. Capital accumulates by impoverishing those who produce it, and it survives by keeping them divided, distracted, and afraid. But history does not stand still. All of human history is the history of class struggle. Every system that once claimed to be eternal collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Feudalism fell when it could no longer contain the forces it had created. Capitalism will fall for the same reason. It produces its own gravediggers in the working class it exploits. The worker has nothing to lose but the chains that bind labor to profit and life to survival. The worker has a world to gain. But liberation will not arrive as a gift. It will not be granted by those whose power depends on your silence. It will be achieved only through consciousness, organization, and collective action. Do not be deceived into thinking you are powerless. Power is not merely held, it is produced. Every day, by your hands and minds, you reproduce the system that dominates you. Withdraw that consent. Unite across divisions manufactured to weaken you. Recognize your shared condition and your shared strength. The lies you are taught to accept as reality dissolve the moment you see society as it truly is, not a natural order, but a human construction sustained by human labor, and therefore capable of being transformed by human will. The task before you is not to adapt to injustice, but to abolish it. History waits not for the obedient, but for those who dare to change the world. Capitalism survives not only through force or law, but through the careful construction of belief, presenting exploitation as the natural order of things and inequality as the deserved outcome of individual merit. From early childhood, people are trained to see the existing economic arrangement as inevitable, as though it emerged from nature itself, rather than from historical struggle and material interests. Poverty is framed as personal failure, wealth as moral achievement, and class position as the visible proof of talent and effort, obscuring the underlying relations that actually determine who owns, who works, and who obeys. This illusion is essential to the system. If exploitation were recognized as exploitation, it would provoke resistance. Instead, it is masked as opportunity. The worker is told that wages represent fair exchange, that selling labor power is a free contract between equals, even though one side owns the means of survival and the other owns only the capacity to work. The unequal starting point of this exchange is erased, and necessity is rebranded as choice. What is in reality coercion becomes framed as freedom, and submission becomes mistaken for consent. Inequality is then justified through narratives of merit. The capitalist is celebrated as a visionary, a risk-taker, a genius of innovation, while the labor that actually produces value is rendered invisible or treated as replaceable. The accumulation of wealth is portrayed as proof of intelligence or discipline, ignoring inherited capital, structural advantage, and the unpaid surplus extracted from workers. The poor are examined for moral flaws, while the rich are praised for their success, even when that success depends on suppressing wages, extending working hours, and externalizing suffering onto others. Through this logic, exploitation is not only normalized but moralized. Those at the bottom are taught to feel shame rather than anger, gratitude rather than indignation. They are encouraged to internalize failure and compete with one another for survival, rather than recognizing their shared condition. This competition fragments the working class, preventing collective awareness and ensuring that structural injustice is experienced as individual misfortune. The system thus defends itself not by hiding inequality, but by explaining it away as deserved. The state, education, media, and culture all participate in reinforcing this worldview. Laws protect private property far more fiercely than human life, yet this imbalance is presented as rational governance. Schools teach obedience to authority and respect for hierarchy, preparing individuals for disciplined participation in the labor market. Popular culture glorifies wealth and consumption, presenting luxury as aspiration rather than evidence of exploitation. In this way, ideology becomes material force, shaping how people interpret their own suffering. Capitalism also presents social mobility as proof of fairness, holding up rare exceptions as evidence that anyone can succeed. These stories are used to silence criticism, suggesting that systemic barriers do not exist, only insufficient effort. Yet for every celebrated ascent, millions remain trapped in precarious labor, their lives structured by debt, insecurity, and exhaustion. Mobility functions as a myth that sustains hope while leaving the underlying relations of production untouched. By portraying inequality as merit, capitalism absolves itself of responsibility. Hunger becomes a personal issue, unemployment becomes a lack of skill, homelessness becomes poor decision-making. The system that produces these conditions disappears from view, replaced by moral judgments directed at its victims. This inversion of cause and effect ensures that anger is misdirected downward or inward, never upward, toward the structures that benefit from exploitation. But exploitation is not natural. It is historical. It arose from the violent separation of workers from the means of production, and is maintained through legal, political, and ideological power. Inequality is not the result of unequal contribution, but of unequal ownership. Those who work do not own what they produce, and those who own do not need to work. This contradiction lies at the heart of capitalist society, even as it is concealed beneath the language of fairness and merit. When workers begin to see through these lies, the appearance of inevitability begins to crack. What once seemed like common sense reveals itself as ideology. What was accepted as fate is recognized as a social arrangement that benefits a minority at the expense of the majority. The natural order is exposed as a constructed order, maintained through belief as much as through force, sustained only so long as those it exploits continue to accept its logic, its values, and its definitions of success and failure as their own. Under capitalism, the worker becomes alienated not only from the wealth created by labor, but from the very act of labor itself, from fellow workers, and from their own human potential. Labor, which should be the conscious, creative expression of human life, is transformed into a means of survival imposed by necessity. Work is no longer an affirmation of human purpose but an external obligation, performed under conditions dictated by others, for ends that do not belong to those who perform it. The product of labor stands as the first point of separation. What the worker creates does not belong to them. It confronts them as an alien object owned and controlled by another, often used in ways that contradict the worker's needs or values. The more the worker produces, the less they possess. Their labor enriches the capitalist, strengthens the system that dominates them, and returns to them only as wages barely sufficient to continue working. In this way, the worker's own activity becomes a force that rules over them, rather than serving them. Alienation also penetrates the labor process itself. Work is organized not according to human rhythm, creativity, or fulfillment, but according to efficiency, profit, and control. Tasks are fragmented, repetitive, and stripped of meaning. The worker does not decide what to produce, how to produce it, or why it is produced. Labor becomes mechanical, reducing human beings to extensions of machines, while machines are elevated as symbols of progress. Time is no longer lived, it is sold, measured, and consumed by the demands of production. This condition robs the worker of autonomy. The body and mind are disciplined to meet external demands, leaving little space for self-development. Exhaustion replaces curiosity. Obedience replaces imagination. What should be an expression of life becomes a denial of it, as the worker feels most human outside of work and least human within it. Labor, instead of being life's activity, becomes something to escape from, endured only because survival depends on it. Alienation does not stop at the individual level. It extends into social relationships, separating workers from one another. Capitalism thrives on competition, forcing workers to see each other as rivals rather than allies. Jobs are scarce, wages are limited, and security is fragile, creating an environment where cooperation is punished and self-interest is rewarded. This manufactured competition prevents solidarity and obscures the shared nature of exploitation. Workers are divided by nationality, race, gender, religion, and skill, not because these divisions are natural, but because they are useful. A divided working class cannot recognize its collective power. Each group is encouraged to blame another for declining conditions, while the structure that benefits from this division remains untouched. In this way, alienation becomes a social weapon, isolating individuals and fragmenting collective resistance. The most profound alienation is from human essence itself. Humans are inherently social, creative beings capable of shaping the world consciously and cooperatively. Under capitalism, this potential is suppressed. Creativity is commodified. Social bonds are reduced to transactions. Human worth is measured by productivity and income rather than dignity or contribution to collective life. People begin to see themselves not as full human beings, but as workers, consumers, or failures within the market. This alienation is reinforced daily through culture and ideology. Success is defined narrowly as economic achievement, while care, solidarity, and community are treated as secondary or unproductive. The worker is taught to identify with the system that exploits them, to take pride in endurance rather than question why endurance is necessary. Even suffering is framed as character building, transforming exploitation into a moral test rather than a social injustice. Yet alienation is not an eternal condition. It arises from specific social relations, and it can be overcome by transforming those relations. When workers recognize that their isolation is imposed, that their labor is collectively productive, and that their interests are shared rather than opposed, alienation begins to lose its hold. The realization that labor creates all wealth, and that those who labor should control its products, opens the possibility of reclaiming work as a human activity rather than a tool of domination. As consciousness grows, the worker begins to see beyond the imposed separation, recognizing that what appears as individual struggle is in fact a collective condition, and that what has been taken from them, the product of labor, control over work, and genuine human connection, can only be reclaimed through collective action that transforms labor from an alien force into a shared expression of human life. The ideas that dominate society do not arise from neutral reflection or collective agreement. They are produced by those who dominate material life and then imposed as universal truth. The ruling class, by virtue of its control over economic resources, also commands the production of ideas, shaping culture, morality, and what passes for common sense. What people come to regard as obvious, natural, or reasonable is rarely questioned precisely because it has been carefully constructed to appear unquestionable. Culture under class society is not a mirror of human experience, but a filtered projection of ruling interests. Art, media, education, and tradition are all shaped to reinforce existing power relations. Wealth is aestheticized, poverty is normalized, and obedience is romanticized. Stories celebrate individual success while erasing collective labor. Suffering is framed as personal struggle rather than social consequence. Through repetition, these narratives become familiar, and familiarity hardens into belief. Morality itself is molded to serve property and authority. What is deemed right or wrong often aligns conveniently with what protects ownership and hierarchy. Accumulating vast wealth is praised as ambition, while questioning why that wealth exists alongside deprivation is condemned as envy or irresponsibility. Exploitation becomes respectable when it is legal. Resistance becomes immoral when it threatens order. In this way, moral judgment is detached from human need and attached instead to the preservation of power. This ideological dominance is most effective when it disguises itself as common sense. People are taught not that capitalism is good, but that it is simply how things are. Alternatives are dismissed as unrealistic, dangerous, or childish before they are even understood. The existing order is presented as the result of human nature rather than historical development, making inequality appear inevitable rather than produced. When people believe there is no alternative, submission no longer feels imposed but rational. Education plays a central role in this process. Schools prioritize discipline, punctuality, and obedience, training individuals to function within hierarchical workplaces. Critical thought is encouraged only within safe boundaries, never allowed to question the foundations of property and power. History is taught as a sequence of great individuals rather than collective struggle, obscuring the role of the masses in shaping society. Students learn to adapt, not to transform. Language itself becomes an ideological tool. Words like success, freedom, responsibility, and efficiency are loaded with class meaning. Success is defined by wealth accumulation. Freedom is reduced to consumer choice. Responsibility is imposed on individuals while structures escape accountability. Efficiency is valued over well-being. By controlling language, the ruling class controls thought, limiting what can be imagined and what can be said. The media reinforces this worldview daily. News frames economic crises as technical problems rather than systemic failures. Workers' demands are portrayed as disruptive, while corporate interests are treated as rational necessities. Violence by the oppressed is sensationalized, while structural violence by the system remains invisible. Through selective attention and framing, ideology becomes lived reality, shaping emotions as much as opinions. Religion and tradition are often mobilized to sanctify inequality. Suffering is given spiritual meaning. Patience is praised as virtue. Reward is promised elsewhere. diverting attention from injustice here. Hierarchy is justified as divine order or cultural heritage, discouraging rebellion by framing it as moral transgression rather than social necessity. In this way, ideology penetrates not only the mind but the conscience. What makes ruling class ideology so powerful is that it does not feel imposed. It feels like one's own thought. People defend ideas that harm them because those ideas have been internalized as truth. The worker comes to see exploitation as fair exchange, domination as leadership, and resignation as realism. Power no longer needs to silence dissent when it can shape perception. Yet ideology is not omnipotent. It cracks under the pressure of lived experience. When promises fail, when hardship persists despite obedience, when inequality becomes impossible to justify, doubt emerges. The realization that what was presented as common sense serves specific interests opens space for critical consciousness. When people begin to question why society is organized as it is, ideology loses its invisibility, revealing itself not as truth but as a tool, constructed to maintain a world where the interests of a few are mistaken for the destiny of all. What capitalism presents as freedom is in reality a carefully structured form of economic coercion, concealed behind the language of choice and individual autonomy. The worker is told they are free because no chains bind their hands and no master openly commands them, yet this freedom exists only within the narrow boundaries set by material necessity. One may choose where to work, but not whether to work. One may choose which employer to serve, but not whether to sell labor in order to survive. This is freedom in form, but compulsion in substance. The foundation of this coercion lies in private ownership of the means of production. A small class controls land, factories, technology, and resources, while the majority is excluded from direct access to the conditions of life. Because workers do not own what they need to live, they are compelled to sell their labor power to those who do. This transaction is presented as voluntary exchange, yet refusal means deprivation, insecurity, and eventual ruin. Choice under threat is not freedom, it is necessity wearing a mask. Wage labor is thus enforced not by law alone, but by hunger, debt, and fear. The worker agrees to conditions not because they are just, but because the alternative is worse. Long hours, unsafe environments, inadequate pay, and humiliating discipline are endured because survival depends on acceptance. The contract appears equal on paper, but the power imbalance is absolute in reality. One side negotiates from abundance, the other from desperation. This coercion is further obscured by the ideology of individual responsibility. Workers are told that their position reflects their choices, that success or failure is a personal outcome rather than a structural one. If wages are low, it is because skills are insufficient. If work is degrading, it is because better options were not pursued. In this way, systemic constraint is reinterpreted as personal fault, and coercion is internalized as self-blame. Capitalism also fragments coercion across millions of daily decisions, making it difficult to recognize as force. No single act compels the worker, yet the totality of conditions leaves no real alternative. Rent must be paid, food must be bought, health care must be afforded. Time itself becomes an enemy measured against bills and deadlines. Under such pressure, consent is extracted continuously, not once, and resistance becomes costly at every moment. Even leisure is shaped by this logic. Free time exists primarily to restore labor power, to prepare the worker to return to work. Consumption replaces rest, offering momentary relief through commodities that must themselves be purchased with wages. What appears as personal enjoyment is often structured by the same economic pressures, reinforcing dependence rather than relieving it. The worker is free to consume, but only what wages allow, and only in ways that keep the cycle intact. Political freedom under capitalism does not dissolve this economic coercion. Formal rights coexist comfortably with material deprivation. One may vote, speak, and assemble, yet these freedoms are constrained by exhaustion, insecurity, and the constant threat of unemployment. A worker struggling to survive has little capacity to challenge power effectively. Economic domination empties political rights of substance, turning freedom into abstraction rather than lived reality. The labour market itself functions as a disciplinary mechanism. Unemployment is maintained not as a failure but as a tool, ensuring a reserve of labour that pressures those employed to accept worsening conditions. The fear of replacement keeps wages low and obedience high. This silent threat enforces conformity without the need for overt repression, making coercion appear invisible and therefore acceptable. What makes this system particularly resilient is that it convinces people they are free while binding them more tightly than open command ever could. Coercion that is recognized invites resistance. Coercion that is mistaken for choice invites compliance. The worker defends the system that constrains them because it appears to grant autonomy, even as it dictates the terms of survival. True freedom cannot exist where the conditions of life are owned by a minority and rented back to the majority. Freedom requires the ability to refuse exploitation without facing destitution, to participate in production as a conscious, collective activity rather than as an individual struggle for survival. Until the material basis of life is held in common, freedom under capitalism will remain a formal illusion, experienced as choice while functioning as compulsion, shaping lives through necessity while insisting that necessity is liberty. Liberation does not emerge from isolated awareness or individual success, but from the development of collective class consciousness and organized action among those who are exploited. As long as workers experience their conditions as personal problems rather than shared realities, the system remains intact. Consciousness becomes revolutionary only when individuals recognize themselves not as separate competitors within the market, but as members of a class whose labor sustains society and whose exploitation is systemic rather than accidental. Class consciousness begins with recognition. Workers must come to understand that their struggles are not the result of personal failure, poor choices, or moral deficiency, but of a social structure designed to extract value from their labor. Low wages, insecurity, exhaustion, and alienation are not isolated misfortunes, but common conditions produced by the same economic relation. When this understanding spreads, the narratives imposed by ruling ideology lose their grip, and suffering is no longer internalized as shame but understood as injustice. This awareness alone, however, is insufficient. Capitalism can tolerate discontent so long as it remains fragmented. Individual anger dissipates easily. Collective clarity does not. Organization transforms consciousness into material force. Through unions, councils, movements, and political formations, workers convert shared understanding into coordinated action. Organization gives structure to resistance, continuity to struggle, and direction to collective will, allowing workers to confront power not as isolated individuals but as a unified social force. Through organization, workers learn cooperation in practice, not merely in theory. They discover that solidarity is not an abstract moral principle but a practical necessity. When workers act together, they reduce the power imbalance that defines capitalist relations. A single worker can be replaced. A united workforce cannot be ignored. Collective action disrupts the illusion of inevitability by demonstrating that production, profit, and social stability depend entirely on labor's consent. Class consciousness also cuts through artificial divisions imposed to weaken resistance. Differences of nationality, race, gender, religion, and skill level are exploited to fragment the working class and redirect anger away from its source. Organization creates spaces where these divisions can be confronted and overcome through shared struggle. Unity does not erase difference, but it subordinates it to common interests, revealing that exploitation operates across identities while benefiting a single class. As organization deepens, workers begin to see themselves not merely as victims, but as agents of historical change. They recognize that labor produces all wealth, that society functions through their collective activity, and that the ruling class depends on their compliance. This realization shifts the balance of power psychologically as well as materially. Fear gives way to confidence. Isolation gives way to solidarity. What once appeared impossible becomes imaginable. Collective struggle also reshapes values. Competition is replaced by cooperation. Obedience is replaced by participation. Decision-making becomes democratic rather than hierarchical. In the process of organizing against exploitation, workers begin to prefigure a different social order, one based on shared control over production and collective determination of social priorities. The struggle itself becomes a school, educating participants in self-governance and mutual responsibility. Liberation cannot be granted from above. No reform handed down by elites can abolish exploitation at its root, because those who benefit from domination have no interest in dismantling it. Only those who experience exploitation daily have the motive and capacity to end it. Collective organization concentrates this capacity, turning scattered resistance into sustained challenge, transforming discontent into power. History demonstrates that every significant advance in human freedom has been won through organized struggle. Rights were not gifted, they were forced into existence by collective action that disrupted the existing order. The same principle applies to the abolition of class domination. Capitalism will not collapse from moral critique alone, but from the organized power of those whose labor it exploits. When workers recognize themselves as a class, unite across imposed divisions, and organize to control the conditions of their labor and lives, liberation ceases to be a distant ideal and becomes a practical possibility. The transformation of society begins when those who produce its wealth also claim the authority to decide how that wealth is used, how work is organized, and how human life is valued, turning collective consciousness into collective power capable of reshaping the world from the foundations upward. All that you have been taught to accept as reality has served one purpose: to keep power where it is and labor where it kneels. Exploitation was disguised as order, inequality dressed as merit, coercion renamed freedom, and isolation imposed as common sense. Yet, beneath these illusions lies a simple truth that cannot be erased by ideology or force. Society moves by the labor of the many, not the privilege of the few. The world you inhabit is not fixed by nature or fate, but constructed through human relations that can be dismantled and rebuilt. The moment workers recognize themselves as a class, the lies begin to lose their power. When consciousness replaces resignation and organization replaces isolation, the machinery of domination begins to stall. What has been made to seem eternal reveals its fragility. What has been declared impossible reveals its necessity. Liberation is not an abstract dream but a historical task, waiting for those who understand that their collective strength outweighs every institution built to suppress it. The future does not belong to capital, hierarchy, or inherited power. It belongs to those who produce, who organize, and who refuse to accept a world built on their exhaustion and silence. When labor ceases to obey, when consciousness becomes action, and when unity replaces division, the lies collapse, and history moves forward not by command, but by collective will.